00181. You only get one. October 2005. It seemed like the chase was a little more cult-like than Theo originally thought, since they tried to blow him up for taking over the hand. He wasn't that upset, but he changed the way he handled dealing with them moving forward. Whenever they showed up to cause problems, the hand were ordered to fight and capture them. If they had issues or the enemy was too strong, they would call for backup, and either Theo or real ninjas would show up to handle them. Instead of killing any of them, Theo collected them and put them in a temporary prison. He then had people search through their memories for the locations of chased bases and other members. It took a while, but Theo and his team were able to capture a good portion of the chased and their leadership. Once they had Stick and a few other notable leaders, he decided to have a sit-down and chat with them. 3 people were locked in a small room, and none of them looked happy. The first was an older man who wore what looked like a Vietnam-era U.S. Army uniform. His faded green-colored army jacket was open, which exposed his gray-colored t-shirt, while he wore small blacked-out glasses under his green hat. He was an older man with short-cut gray hair and wrinkles that covered his gaunt face. Seated next to him on the floor was a younger man with shoulder-length black hair. He was shirtless, which showed off his impressive physique along with a bunch of scars that covered his body. He was stoic as he waited for whatever was going to happen. The last person in the room was a young woman with brown hair and eyes who paced back and forth in worry. She was slim and almost looked delicate if you weren't paying attention. But her body was in fact muscular and full of power, like a taut bowstring ready to be released. She wore plain-looking street clothes, jeans, a band shirt, and a brown jacket. "Will you stop that?" the man with glasses finally asked. The woman turned to look at the man as she asked in a nervous tone, "How are you two so calm? What will happen, will happen," the younger man said with his eyes closed. The older man nodded in agreement as he said, "They want us for something. Otherwise, we would already be dead. Now we just have to wait to see what it is." "But what if they plan to torture us?" the woman asked. "Then we just need to endure until we can escape," the younger man said without an ounce of emotion. "Torture isn't really my thing, and it doesn't help to use it on people," a voice said from the door as it opened. Into the room stepped Ezekiel with a smile on his face as he glanced at the 3 other people in the room. The woman moved back towards her companions as Ezekiel shut the door and said, "You know, there is one thing I don't really like." Ezekiel glanced at the 3 people in the room before he said, "And that is being blown up when I am just trying to have a conversation. It's rather rude and shows the other side isn't sincere in their actions." The older man turned in Ezekiel's direction as he said, "You're part of the hand. There is nothing sincere about you." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You should be glad I don't consider your previous actions for what they were, or we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, Stick." "That doesn't change the fact you are part of the hand," Stick said with a slight frown. "I am not part of the hand. I only took it over after I disposed of their old leadership," Ezekiel said as he leveled a glare at the other 2 people in the room, since it would be wasted on Stick. "Now I don't want to waste any more time with this bullshit, so I'll make this completely clear for all of you. The hand is no more, and what is left of it is being used by me for my own projects," Ezekiel said as he raised one hand and pointed at the other 3 people in the room before he said, "That means you and your little club are obsolete and no longer serve a purpose. Going forward, do not mess with the remnants of the hand or attack them." Ezekiel focused his chakra aura and pressed it down on all of them as he said, "If you do, I will personally do the same thing to the chase that I've done with the hand. Is that understood?" Ezekiel asked as he applied more pressure to them with his aura. When none of them replied, even after half a minute or so, Ezekiel dropped his aura and turned around to walk out of the room. Just before he disappeared from sight, he said, "Consider yourselves warned and make sure you collect the rest of your people before you leave." Ezekiel left the door open as he walked out of the room, and after a few moments the woman collapsed to the ground as she asked, "What the hell was that?" The younger man stood up as he said, "Another one of his powers, most likely." Stick also stood up as he said, "Let's go." "Go? You really think he is letting us go?" the woman asked as she wiped a bit of sweat from her forehead. The younger man reached down to help the woman up as he asked, "Why would he leave the door open if he wasn't letting us go? To mess with us?" Stick took the lead as he flicked out a collapsible baton and walked towards the door as he said, "There's only one way to find out if it's a trick." The other 2 quickly followed along behind Stick as they traveled through a hallway. On each side of it, spaced every 10 feet or so, were doors that opened to small prison cells similar to what they were trapped in. After a few minutes of walking, they came to a larger open area of the prison block. In all of the cells that lined the area were people who immediately recognized the trio and called out for help. The woman was the first to act and moved towards a guard room next to the tunnel they just exited. Once inside, she glanced at the control board for a few moments before she flipped a couple switches, and it opened all of the doors in the area. After everyone was released and started to make their way outside, Stick turned to the younger man and woman as he said, "Spread the word that we will not act against the hand for now." "Then what are we supposed to do?" the woman asked. "I want everyone to observe their actions and report their findings. While I don't like it, we need to verify what they are up to and see if what that person said is true. Can we really trust what he said? They are part of the hand after all," the woman asked. "Time will tell if what they said is true or not," the younger man said. The woman glanced at all the chaste members who were still walking out of the abandoned prison as she asked, "And if it's true and the hand is no longer the hand we once fought? We will figure that out when the time comes," Stick said. VVVVV. After Ezekiel finished up with the chaste, he created a portal to Culver University to visit a certain scientist who was working on a super soldier project for the government. Ezekiel tracked the project for a little while now, and with its progress, he figured he might as well stop in and introduce himself finally. Ezekiel appeared on the roof of the building the research was being conducted in, and after a quick check around, walked inside. Honestly, with what the project was about, he expected more security for the place and guards. Instead, it was only locked behind a few electronic doors which used RFID badges, which he easily bypassed with his tablet. He also took care of all the camera systems in the building, so he wouldn't show up on any of them. Once inside the main room with all the servers, Ezekiel hooked up his tablet and started copying the data. Once he was finished, he implanted some hidden malware into the data that would scramble it if it was copied. He would still need to check a few other places and make sure there were no other backup copies made. But he already had a good idea who might have those copies, so he wasn't worried. He also connected the servers and systems to his monitoring network so he could track the progress of everything. Once he was done, Ezekiel placed an order on his tablet before he got comfortable and checked over a new video game his clones were creating. About half an hour later, Ezekiel opened a portal to his favorite pizza shop to see Joe, who glanced up for a second before he reached over and picked up a couple pizza boxes. As Ezekiel took the boxes, he said, "Thanks, Joe. Don't worry about it, kid." Ezekiel closed the portal, placed the pizza boxes down, and pulled an ice chest out of his storage seal. He grabbed a root beer from it and cracked it open as he started to browse Vibe. Once he found something interesting, he picked up a slice of pizza and ate as he waited for Dr. Banner to show up. Ezekiel didn't have to wait long for the man as he entered the room, as Ezekiel started on his second slice of pizza and was in the middle of watching one of Nightcrawler's videos. Nightcrawler was still one of the most popular Vibe users around because he didn't try to entertain people. He was just authentic to himself and wholesome, which made people like to watch him. Banner was so engrossed in reading what was in his hands that he didn't notice Ezekiel at all until he started laughing at Nightcrawler doing something stupid and pissing off Kitty. Banner looked up in confusion to see Ezekiel with his feet up on Banner's own desk, eating pizza and watching videos on a tablet. This is a restricted area. You shouldn't be here," Banner said as he nervously pushed on his glasses to straighten them. Ezekiel glanced up from his tablet as he said, "If this place is restricted, you should really up the security. I walked in here with some pizzas and an ice chest, and no one stopped me." Banner glanced at the large ice chest on the ground and pizza boxes on the desk for a moment before he asked, "Really? Who let you through the doors?" "They were unlocked," Ezekiel said with a shrug of his shoulders before he took another bite of his pizza. Banner glanced back at the door he just entered before he turned back to Ezekiel and said, "If that's the case, I'll have someone come by and fix them. But you can't stay here. You need to leave." Ezekiel paused the video on his tablet and set it aside as he said, "I'll leave in a few minutes, Dr. Banner, after I take a few minutes of your time." Banner's eyes narrowed slightly, and he backed up a bit as he asked, "Who are you?" "I'm just a person who stopped by to give you some friendly advice about your gamma-induced super soldier experiment. But if you need a name, people call me Ezekiel." Banner was alarmed and moved closer to one of the computers and where a panic alarm button was for emergencies as he asked, "How do you know about my project?" Did you hack into our systems? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, Nope, that type of thing doesn't interest me. Then how do you know what Betty and I are working on? I can see the future, and I wanted to warn you about it. Well, if you are willing to. I guess not. Ezekiel said, and Banner pushed the panic button, and an alarm started to blare out. Ezekiel stood up from his seat, sealed away the rest of the pizza, his tablet, and then the ice chest before he picked up his root beer and said, Well, since I don't have much time, the only thing I will say is be careful around General Ross and don't let him rush you into things. Why should I? Banner froze as Ezekiel created a portal, raised his root beer up, and said, Catch you later, Doc. 00182. It only takes once. A couple weeks passed after Theo visited Bruce Banner. While some more security was added to Banner's lab, nothing else was changed, and they didn't find the backdoor Theo planted in the servers. Ross didn't even show up, which surprised Theo the most since he figured that guy would have at least checked in and made sure the project wasn't compromised. But Theo didn't really waste much time on it. He just wanted to at least meet Banner and give him a warning. Since that goal was completed, Theo focused on his other projects instead. The first one he checked in on was his Mars project that was about to enter the next phase. Magneto already collected all the ice they would need and crashed them into the planet a month ago, and now Theo wanted to test a theory that might make terraforming the atmosphere a lot easier. Theo arrived on Mars through a portal at the temporary base he created there. With him was the person who might be able to speed up the terraforming process. Theo glanced at Hashirama as he asked, How big of a forest do you think you can create with your chakra reserves? Hashirama laughed before he said, Maybe 100 feet, if I'm lucky. What if you make smaller trees and not full-grown ones? Hashirama rubbed his chin in thought for a while before he said, It's doable, but would smaller trees be better? The more trees breathing in carbon dioxide, the better. Our goal is to get a higher oxygen mix for the atmosphere. We also need to heat up the planet, but Tao was talking about doing that with some spells to save time. Theo said, All right, with younger trees I could expand the size to a few hundred feet. Maybe. Theo nodded in understanding as he said, I'll just send you here every time your chakra is full to create another patch of trees until this area is full. Hashirama looked out over the desolate Martian landscape as he asked, You think the trees will survive here? Tao created a magic circle that keeps the temperature in this area for about 10 miles at around 75 degrees Fahrenheit for this experiment. We also dropped a few ice asteroids in this area, so it has groundwater for the trees. Hashirama nodded before he said, All right, I'll give it a shot. Hashirama walked off the platform and out onto the red Martian soil before he did a few hand signs as he said, would release secret technique, nativity of a world of trees. Hashirama slammed his hands onto the ground, and a moment later a pulse of chakra spread out to cover just over 300 feet. After a few seconds, trees started to sprout and shoot out of the ground all over the area. The trees weren't that large, most of them only growing to 7 or 8 feet tall. As Theo watched, he was surprised because not only did trees get created, but small bushes and other plants also grew up all around the area. Once Hashirama was finished, the area looked completely out of place with its greens and browns surrounded by red. Hashirama walked out of the forest he just created about a minute later and said, I'm surprised it worked so well. I half expected it to fail because of how alien this planet is. Theo smiled and patted Hashirama on the shoulder as he said, If it wasn't for Chakra and how stupid it is, I would agree. Theo glanced at the newly created forest one more time before he asked, How long until your chakra pool is fully restored? I'll need to eat and a few hours of rest. Then I should be able to use that again. Theo nodded in understanding as he created a portal back home and left to go train while Hashirama recovered. With the Mars project in its next phase, Theo turned his attention towards his next Vibe project. He already had his first video game created and was almost finished with 2 more. Both games were ones he knew would be extremely popular and planned to release around the same time as he launched a new service for Vibe. The service itself would be for video games mostly, but would also tie into the rest of Vibe's platforms seamlessly. The game service was basically Theo's own version of Steam and would function the same way once it was completely up and running. Theo already checked, and as far as he could tell, no one was currently making Steam or the games he planned to release. The first game was basically Counter-Strike, but with updated graphics closer to CS. go because of how advanced the hardware was. He already had the game finished, but he was just polishing the game up to make sure it was perfect. He also created some very user-friendly modding tools so people could create all kinds of fun maps. The other game he created was Half-Life, well, Black Mesa if you want to get technical. The game itself was also finished besides some more polish that his clones were doing. It's surprisingly easy to build a complete game when you work on everything yourself and can create hundreds of clones to help. Sure, Theo needed to learn some new skills along the way he didn't originally know, like 3D modeling. But it honestly didn't take long at all, and with the help of ninjas to act as the voice actors for the game. Theo, in theory, created the game for almost no money besides the computers he needed to buy for his clones. Those 3 projects would all be launched at nearly the same time just before Christmas of this year. Theo already picked out the vibe users he planned to give the games to. His goal was to give them early access copies so they could produce content just before launch. He doubted he needed to do that, since he was sure both games would be massive hits, but it never hurt to help. He also started working on other popular multiplayer games he knew would do well, like TF2, Dota. As for single-player games, he already started on building a customer game engine for single-player games and planned to make games like Fallout, Elder Scrolls, Witcher, Dark Souls, and others. Sure, there were a few games that were similar to ones from his past life, but overall a lot of things were different. It was the same thing for some popular movies and TV shows. Sure, they were close to the same, but maybe the story was slightly different or they used different actors. Theo also planned to start a production company in a year or 2 to go along with the publishing company he was working on. His end goal was to dominate all media from books, movies, and games since it would provide a lot of money. VVVVV. It was early morning and Theo sent a clone to school today because he planned to check in with Adrian. He would normally send a clone to do it, but he wanted a break from all the kids at school he had to deal with. Theo first hinged into Ezekiel before he created a portal to his temporary office building. His office was still the same as before with the whole top floor gutted. The only thing in the room was a couple of desks, the model for the Vibe building, and a contractor's table with some plans on top of it. Ezekiel walked over to the windows that faced the area currently being worked on and smiled. From the top floor, Ezekiel could see the whole area and was happy with the progress Adrian completed so far. It was slower than it could be, but if nothing unforeseen happened, he would meet the contract deadline for his bonus. The area in question was already halfway torn down with the larger, more troublesome buildings already taken care of. It left more buildings left to tear down, but they were all a lot smaller and easier to do. If it wasn't for the fact Adrian was making sure everything was recycled properly, he could just bulldoze the buildings and be done in a few weeks to a month. Ezekiel studied the whole place for a little while before he focused on one area. He was pretty sure that's where Adrian currently was, so he created a portal there and walked through it. As Ezekiel stepped out, he was greeted by the noise of a busy construction site along with dust in the air. Not far from him was Adrian as he talked with a couple of people who were in hard hats. Ezekiel wasted no time and walked up to them and said, "Good morning." The 3 men turned around and Adrian smiled before he said, "Good morning, Ezekiel." Adrian glanced at one of the people he was talking with before and said, "Go grab him a hard hat." "On it, boss," the man said before he took off. Ezekiel glanced around the area as he said, "Looks like things are coming along nicely." Adrian nodded as he said, "We estimated we should be completely done with demolishing by summer next year, about 3 months ahead of schedule." The man came back and handed Ezekiel a hard hat as Ezekiel said, "Great. That's even better than I expected. Well, everything has been going smoothly and we haven't run into any major issues with these smaller buildings," Adrian said before he knocked on the top of his wooden contractor's desk. For the next hour or so, Ezekiel hung out around the construction site as he chatted with Adrian about a few things before he received a text message from Tony that read, "Help." Since Tony didn't call him a million times, but sent a single text message, Ezekiel excused himself and created a portal to Tony's workshop. When he stepped through the portal, he was greeted by Tony's lab being a little more trash than normal. As Ezekiel glanced around the room, Jarvis said, "Welcome, Ezekiel. You will find Mr. Stark upstairs along with Mississippi Potts." As Ezekiel walked towards the door, he asked, "Where's Happy?" "He was given the day off, and I believe he is spending the day with his girlfriend." Ezekiel opened the door, and as he walked upstairs, he heard Pepper as she yelled, "God damn it, Tony. It was only once." "I know," Tony said, his voice low and hollow. Well, what the hell are we supposed to do now? I don't know, Tony said as Ezekiel walked out into the living room area to see it was also a mess. Pepper picked up one of the couch cushions and threw it at Tony as she said, "This is your fault, so you need to fix it." Tony dodged the cushion and glanced at Pepper as he said, "We could get married. We aren't even dating properly yet, and you want to get married?" Pepper yelled as she picked up a flower vase and threw it towards Tony. Maybe I should come back later," Ezekiel said as the vase crashed against the wall behind Tony. Tony looked at Ezekiel like he found his savior and moved towards him as he said, "No, you're perfect. Just the person we need." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Not from what I heard. I think you guys should work this out yourselves." Pepper frowned at Ezekiel as she said, "That idiot got me pregnant. Last I checked, it takes 2 people to create a baby, so it's not completely his fault," Ezekiel said with a shrug. Tony nodded in agreement as he said, "See, he at least understands. Fine, we are both at fault. But that doesn't solve the fact I am still pregnant and we aren't married, let alone really dating." "Then just get married," Ezekiel said with a sigh. "I don't know if I even like him that much," Pepper said with a huff. Ezekiel shook his head as he created a portal in front of himself as he said, "You liked him enough to sleep with him, so figure it out." Ezekiel quickly disappeared through the portal before they could respond and left them alone to work out their own mess. While he was happy they finally got together, he didn't expect this mess. Well, it didn't matter too much. He was sure this would just force them together sooner or Tony would end up with another baby's mama. 00183. Meeting a future crime lord. Theo stayed away from Tony over the next couple weeks to let him sort out his personal issues with Pepper. Instead, he focused on training and looking for more potential threats he could stop early or steer in the right direction. With the help of cell phones, he found one in New York that he was really looking forward to meeting, and he hoped he could point them onto a new path going forward. Either that or he would have to destroy them before they had the proper chance to grow. Theo changed into Ezekiel before he created a portal outside of a slightly run-down building in the area of Hell's Kitchen just after dusk. The person he was looking for had his small base of operations here, and while they were already considered a criminal, the crimes were pretty minor and could be overlooked since he currently targeted other criminals and not regular civilians. The man was smart since he knew no one in their line of work would report what happened to the police. Ezekiel stepped out of the portal in front of what could only be described as a fixer-upper, and that was being nice about it. The building was aged like most brownstones in New York City, but this one had a lot of issues. Some of the bricks that lined the front of the building were missing. A couple of windows were currently boarded over and graffiti covered part of the building. Ezekiel glanced around the area for a moment to take in the rest of the neighborhood, which matched the building's aesthetics before he walked up to the entryway door. Instead of pushing a button to be let in by one of the tenants, Ezekiel used a minor spell to unlock the door and stepped inside and headed to the second floor. The main hallway for the second floor was dark since only a handful of lights currently functioned, while the rest would flicker randomly as they tried to work. The peeled wallpaper, faded paint, and ruined carpet just added to the building's rundown appearance. But it wasn't just the look of the building, but also the smell that completed the whole look. It wasn't overpowering or unbearable, but there was a faint, musty smell of mold that clung to Ezekiel as he walked towards the apartment he was looking for. Once Ezekiel reached the door, he knocked on it a few times before he took a step back and waited. After a few moments, someone behind the door said, "I don't know who you are, so go away. I came to talk with a Mr. Fisk, Wilson Fisk to be exact. I was led to believe this is his current registered address. Is Mr. Fisk currently home?" Ezekiel asked with a friendly smile. "Hold on," said the person on the other side of the door before he moved away from it. While it was muffled, Ezekiel with his improved hearing could hear someone as they asked, "Boss, someone in a nice suit is asking for you. They kind of look like a fancy lawyer or something. Did they give a name?" Another man asked with a soft baritone voice. "No, they just said they were looking for you and used your full name." "Then ask them who they are," the man said in a slightly annoyed tone. A moment later, the man came back to the door and said, "Who are you?" "My name is Ezekiel. Tell Mr. Fisk I am here to talk about his future career path." Ezekiel didn't listen in to their conversation this time, but after about a minute, the door was opened by a man in his 20s wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He moved to the side and gestured for Ezekiel to come in as he said, "Please come in." The inside of the apartment was actually in nice shape, like it had been redone recently. It wasn't a full remodel or anything like that, but the walls looked newly painted and the floors also looked in good shape. All the furniture in the apartment was also new, and once inside the place, it no longer had the moldy smell of the hallway outside. After the man closed the door, he led Ezekiel past the living room and into a bedroom turned office. The office itself was neat and tidy with a couple of bookshelves, a large oak desk, a couple of nice leather chairs, and a small coffee table. Behind the large desk sat an impressively sized man who almost made the desk seem small. He wore a decent quality gray-colored suit with a black tie that looked like it could burst apart at the seams at any time. Fisk looked a lot like his counterpart in the TV show, except he had the body mass of his comic book counterpart and was the largest person Ezekiel's met so far. Fisk sat behind the desk as he watched Ezekiel enter the room before he said, "You can close the door. I will call you if I need you." "Understood," Fisk's lackey said as he quickly shut the door. Ezekiel didn't stand on ceremony and sat down in one of the leather chairs before he said, "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Fisk. Or do you prefer people to call you Kingpin? Actually, you just started out, so no one should call you that yet. It's just what you want people to call you one day." Fisk narrowed his eyes slightly while his bulk shifted forward in his seat as he leaned over his desk and said, "You seem to know a lot about me, and I have no idea who you are. I know a lot about you because I can see the future, and I have to say you're pretty impressive. Climbing up from nothing to become the king of the New York underworld with connections all over the world," Ezekiel said with a smile. Fisk studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he asked, "If you can see the future, then why are you here? Are you trying to ride on my coattails?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "My vision isn't as small as yours. New York means nothing to me, and neither does the underworld since I plan to destroy it." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I'm here to give you a different path forward, one that doesn't involve crime. One where the woman you love doesn't end up leaving you because she finds out what type of business you're really in." Fisk sat back in his chair a bit before he asked, "And why should I believe you?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "You have no reason to believe me, and I am not going to give you one because I know the type of man you are. What I will do is offer you a deal to go straight." Ezekiel tapped his storage seal and pulled out his tablet before he tapped on it a few times, and a holographic screen appeared between him and Fisk. On the screen was a bank account with $1 million currently in it that Ezekiel pointed at as he said, "That would be the first part of the deal. If you agree to turn away from crime now, I'll give you that to help grow your business. I already have close to $1 million myself." Fisk said with little interest, "This is only the first part, and unlike the money you collected, this money you don't have to worry about spending. It's all traceable, and the IRS won't come after you for it. That means you could easily expand without much issue. What else are you offering? I know you want to focus on real estate, so I will get you the proper permits whenever you need them without having to wait or pay for them. I'll even do you one better and throw in a building for your first project." Ezekiel said with a smirk, "Is that it?" Fisk asked, unimpressed with Ezekiel's offer. Ezekiel thought about it for a few minutes before he said, "I can also help you get into politics later. Mayor Fisk of New York doesn't sound bad, does it? Or maybe Senator Fisk? President Fisk? It's all possible if you keep your nose clean. Sounds like a kid's dream," Fisk said as he steepled his fingers together over his belly that was mostly muscle. "And so does the kingpin of the New York City underworld," Ezekiel said with a shrug. Ezekiel sealed his tablet away and pulled out a card with his name and phone number on it before he stood up. He placed the card on Fisk's desk as he said, "I'll give you a month to think about my offer. If you call me after a month, I won't pick up." Fisk glanced at the card as Ezekiel created a portal and said, "I'll see myself out." Fisk watched as Ezekiel disappeared, though the portal before it snapped closed after him. He stared at where the portal was for a little while before he called out, "Bring me a drink and make it strong." Ezekiel portaled over to the main base after he left Fisk's to find a few people and assign a new task. He could technically do it with his tablet, but Gabby complained when he didn't visit the base at least once a week. So he always made at least one trip to the base each week to make Gabby happy. Ezekiel wasted no time as he moved towards his personal office to find a few people. While it was his office, it was partly taken over by the ninjas. It worked as their mission hall, even though Ezekiel was currently the only one who really gave them missions. Since that was the case, There were always at least a handful of people in the office. Ezekiel reached his office within a few minutes and found Shikaka Nara as he relaxed in a chair playing on his phone along with a couple of other people playing on phones or reading. Shikaka glanced up at Ezekiel as he walked in and asked, "Need something?" "I need a team to watch someone for the next month or so." Shikaka typed on his phone for a moment as he said, "Send me the details and it will be done." After Ezekiel gave him Fisk's information, he headed towards the rec room since that is where Gabby tended to hang out at. Once he arrived, he found Gabby, Sky, Ava, and one of the younger widow girls in the middle of a game of air hockey. Gabby didn't notice Ezekiel at first because her back was to him, but as he walked closer she caught a whiff of him and immediately turned around to find him. As she ran over to give him a hug, Ava said, "Wait, don't leave." A second later, Sky and the other girl cheered as they scored another point since Gabby wasn't there to help guard. Gabby didn't care as she bolted towards Ezekiel and gave him a hug. As she hugged him, she asked, "Did you come to visit me?" Ezekiel patted her head as he said, "Yup. I figured it was around dinner time, and I would see if you wanted to go eat." Ava and the other girls came over as Gabby said, "Sure. Let's go. What about your friends?" Ezekiel asked as he looked towards the other girls. Gabby glanced at the other girls as she said, "Of course they are going to come too." 00184. Tony needs advice. Another week passed by before Ezekiel received a text message from Tony asking for help. Since Tony didn't go into detail again, Ezekiel was positive it had to do with Pepper. It was something Tony texted him about almost every day. Ezekiel ignored most of them or sent a quick reply most of the time, but he figured he would finally visit Tony in person since he hadn't seen him in over 3 weeks. Ezekiel portaled into Tony's workshop to find him slouched in a chair as he gazed blankly at his computer screen. Ezekiel moved closer to see what Tony was looking at and found it was open to a website with baby names. Ezekiel smiled and patted Tony on the shoulder as he said, "This looks like a positive step in the right direction." Tony turned to look over at Ezekiel as he said, "I guess. But Pepper doesn't really talk to me right now." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he asked, "What happened this time?" "She said I need to grow up and start acting more mature." Ezekiel nodded along as he said, "I've been telling you that since I've met you." Tony punched Ezekiel's shoulder as he said, "You act more childish than me most of the time. Which means I'm a great judge on who acts like a child," Ezekiel said as he grinned back at Tony. Tony tossed his hands up in the air as he said, "Fine, I act like a kid. What's so wrong with that?" Ezekiel rubbed his chin as he said, "From Pepper's perspective as a soon-to-be mother, everything. I'm pretty sure she wants someone who can help her raise a child, not act like one themselves." Tony let out a frustrated sigh as he asked, "And how am I supposed to do that when she barely talks to me unless it's about the business? Do I really need to explain this to you?" Ezekiel asked with an annoyed tone. "What can I say? I've only ever had flings. I've never been in a serious relationship and have no idea how they work." Tony said helplessly, "Are you being serious?" Tony nodded his head as he said, "I can easily wine and dine a girl and make sure they are satisfied in bed. But that's all I've ever done." Ezekiel shook his head as he said to himself, "Even I know how to date a woman." Ezekiel let out a sigh before he sat on Tony's desk and said, "Apologize to her first and foremost and tell her you're a huge fucking idiot when it comes to relationships." "I'm not an idiot." Ezekiel leveled a flat look at Tony as he said, "You are literally asking me how to fix your relationship problems." Tony rolled his eyes before he said, "Fine. I might not know how to have a normal relationship." "Good. After you apologize, you just need to be honest with her. Tell her how you feel. If things go smoothly, do something romantic for her and show you actually care about her." Ezekiel focused on Tony as he asked, "You do actually care about her, right?" "Of course I do." "All right. Since that's the case, I'll help you out if you need anything. Since you seem to suck at dating more than Happy." "I do not," Tony said as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Happy's never asked me for advice about his relationship, and he and Anna are doing great." Tony wanted to reply before he stopped himself and after a moment said, "Fine. I guess he is better at keeping a relationship together, but I am better at picking up chicks." Ezekiel smacked the back of Tony's head as he said, "And that's one of the reasons Pepper isn't talking to you. She probably feels like this might just be a fling to you and is scared thinking she is going to be a single mom. Pepper isn't a fling. She means more to me than something like that. Then go tell her and don't brag about how easy you can get other women when you do it." Ezekiel said as he shook his head slightly. Ezekiel spent about an hour as he chatted with Tony and basically called him an idiot whenever he had stupid ideas. Once Tony was confident, he left to go meet Pepper and try to fix his fragile relationship and hopefully met it. Ezekiel had nothing to do himself, so he went back to training since nothing important was going on currently. Actually, he had one project he wanted to do, but he would need Tao's help to accomplish it. He wanted to go out and collect the other Infinity Stones. He mostly needed to get the Power Stone and Soul Stone. He would worry about the Reality Stone when the convergence happened. As for the Mind Stone, he was pretty sure Thanos had it. Maybe, if he had that mind control staff that he would give to Loki when he invaded Earth. If that even happened this time. With that in mind, Ezekiel decided to finally ask and get the project underway. Well, if Tao agreed to help. If not, he would need to find another way to do it. After Ezekiel portaled back to his training room and switched back into Theo, he went over to Tao and said, I want to collect the other Infinity Stones, and I'll need your help to do it. Tao glanced up from her book as she said, I was wondering how much longer you were going to wait to ask. Theo smirked as he asked, Am I that easy to read? At least for this, yes. Yes, you are. I expected you to ask me for help right after we collected the Space Stone. Tao placed her book down and asked, So what do you need my help with? Mainly transport to the planets where the stones are located. I would also need something like what you created for the Space Stone to contain them. Tao nodded in understanding before she asked, If you take the Power Stone, won't that throw off the timeline? I was planning to replace it with a fake like we did with the Tesseract. Tao stood up from her seat as she said, I'll go talk with Agatha since she helped me make the last one. If everything goes smoothly, we should have them finished in a couple weeks. With that, Tao left Theo alone to train. Well, he wasn't alone for long. Theo had to collect his training partners only an hour later and then spent the next few hours sparring before he switched to Fuinjutsu practice. He finished up with magic practice before he called it a night and went to bed. The next day after Theo came home from school, he received a text message from Tony asking for help again. Theo shook his head and let out a sigh before he went to his room, created a clone, and switched with it. About 2 minutes later, Ezekiel was in Tony's workshop, but Tony wasn't there, and he was greeted by Jarvis, who said, Welcome, Ezekiel. Mr. Stark is currently upstairs in his bedroom. Thanks, Jarvis. How are you doing, by the way? Ezekiel asked as he headed towards the door. I am fine, sir. Thanks for asking. Ezekiel quickly made his way upstairs to Tony's room before he stopped and knocked on the door frame and said, You better not be naked. I'm not, but I am trying to figure out what clothes to wear. Ezekiel glanced in the room and found Tony standing in front of his bed with 3 different outfits laid out. Ezekiel moved into the room as he asked, Do you really need my help to pick out an outfit? Yeah. No. I need you for something else. Tony said, and he picked the outfit in the middle, which was a simple black suit with a blue undershirt and no tie. Ezekiel glanced at the outfit for a moment before he asked, So I guess Pepper is talking with you again? Tony smiled as he moved towards his closet and said, Yup. We are even going on a date tonight, which is why I need your help. I wanted to take her to Genosha for dinner and possibly stay there for the week. You think you could get us a room? Ezekiel let out a sigh as he pulled out his tablet and started to type on it as he said, I see how it is. You only use me for my connections. Like you haven't done the same to me. Tony said from inside his walk-in closet. He came out a few minutes later with a small travel suitcase and placed it next to the bed as Ezekiel finished up on his tablet. Ezekiel glanced up from his tablet as he said, All right, I booked you at that restaurant Pepper likes and then got you one of the presidential suites at the Cliffside Hotel. Thanks, I appreciate it. Tony said with a smile. Ezekiel put his tablet away as he asked, When do you guys want to leave? Whenever Pepper gets here. What time did you book our dinner reservation for? I just put you on the list. You can show up whenever you like. Ezekiel said with a smile. Mississippi Potts just entered at the main gate. Jarvis said. Tony grabbed the clothes he was going to wear and asked, Can you greet Pepper for me while I change? Ezekiel shook his head slightly, but left the room and headed downstairs to meet Pepper at the door. When Ezekiel reached the door and opened it up, Pepper was just parking her car. Ezekiel stepped outside, and once Pepper got out of the car, he said, Hey Pepper, how have you been? Pepper smiled before she said, Good, considering everything that's been going on. How about yourself? I've been good. So you're giving Tony a chance, huh? Pepper nodded as she pulled a small suitcase out of her back seat and said, Yeah, we talked things out, and we agreed to see what happens. Good. I think everything will work out fine for you guys, Ezekiel said as he took the suitcase from Pepper and walked her inside the house. Tony came downstairs with his suitcase a minute later, and after a little bit of small talk, Ezekiel portaled them to Genosha. After seeing them off, Ezekiel decided to go get food and go visit Hela. Once he bought food, he contacted Tao and met her in Genosha so she could portal him to Hell, where he stepped out of the portal and greeted Hela. He ended up staying in Hell for almost 8 hours as they watched a few movies before they played some board games together. 00185. Family breakfast? A little over a week passed by, and the deadline for Fisk was almost up. From Theo's surveillance, it didn't look like Fisk would take the deal, but it didn't matter too much. If Fisk wanted to keep trying to be a crime lord, Theo would shut him down before long since he was proactive when it came to threats. Even if Fisk wasn't really a threat to him in the grand scheme of things, Theo instead turned his attention to the Mars project while he waited for Tao to finish up the magic items to contain the Infinity Stones. He transported Hashirama at least 5 times a day to produce plant life around the staging area. They weren't even halfway done yet, but at least the plants and trees had no issue surviving, since water was basically taken care of, and he was working on oxygen with Hashirama. Theo decided to also start collecting what else would be needed to heat up the planet, which is greenhouse gases. Sure, they were already using magic to do it in a small area, but that took a lot of time to make, and Mars was massive compared to what it covered. Theo thought about it for a while, and after talking with a few people, he came up with a solution that could help the Earth and Mars at the same time. Well, it would take a while to do properly, but with the help of magic it was possible. The plan was to build a magic device that collected pollution from manufacturing plants, power plants, and other places that produced large amounts of greenhouse gases. They would then be installed in place and hidden with magic so normal people couldn't find them. It would help reduce carbon emissions around the planet, and Theo could send those to Mars through the device. It would take a lot of work, but a few masters of the mystic arts liked the idea and already started work on some prototypes. As for the more complicated part, Tao would be in charge of creating the receiver device, which would be placed on the opposite side of Mars from where the forest was being planted. While it wasn't perfect and would definitely take a while, it was better than nuking the planet to heat it up. Well, they wouldn't nuke the whole planet, but Theo didn't want to deal with that mess. Besides, he would also be helping the Earth at the same time, so this was a better solution overall. Whether or not he created even smaller devices to help with smaller pollution producers like transport ships, well, Theo would need to think about it because there were millions of places he already planned to target, and the devices took time to make. With not much for Theo himself to do towards the project, and having already completed his training for the night, Theo decided to call it an early day and head to bed. After a shower and swapping with his clone, Theo fell asleep quickly, only to be woken up before his alarm by someone poking his cheek. Theo opened his eyes slowly to see Millie's smiling face looming right in front of him in the dim light of his bedroom. She poked him again as she said, "Get up. We need your help to make breakfast." "We?" Theo asked as he sat up in his bed to see Isaac standing behind Millie. Millie pulled back from leaning over Theo's bed as she said, "Isaac and I wanted to make breakfast for Mom and Dad. And you need my help?" Both of them nodded before Millie said, "We've never used the stove before, so we need your help." Theo focused on them both for a moment before he asked, "So you want me to cook?" "Yeah. Can you?" "Please eat," Millie said as Isaac nodded in agreement and said, "Please, big brother." Theo smiled at his siblings as he said, "Sure, but I am not doing everything alone. Both of you are going to help." Millie and Isaac both nodded seriously as Theo started to get out of bed. As he did, he looked at his alarm clock and froze since it was over an hour and a half before he normally got up. He glanced at his helpers as he asked, "Why did you wake me up so early?" "We want to make pancakes," Millie said. "Pancakes don't take that long to make." Theo let out a sigh before he laid back down in his bed. "Don't go back to sleep. You promised to help us," Millie said with a pout. Theo glanced at Millie as he said, "If I wake up at my normal time, I can easily make pancakes before Mom and Dad are up. So I am going to go back to sleep until then." Theo rolled over in his bed and snuggled back up in his blankets as Millie shared a look with Isaac. A moment later, both of them climbed into Theo's bed with him. As they ruined the blanket burrito he just turned himself into, he asked, "What are you two doing?" "Waiting for you to cook breakfast," Millie said as she tried to steal more of the blankets. Theo let out another sigh as he was snuggled in between Millie and Isaac. It didn't take long for Theo to fall back asleep until Millie's arm smacked him in the face and woke him back up. Millie was sprawled out like a starfish next to him, no longer under the blankets with one arm and leg on top of him. Theo glanced on his other side to find Isaac somehow wrapped in the blankets as half his body hung off the bed and only still on the bed because of the blankets Theo was laying on. Theo removed Millie's arm from his face before he glanced at his alarm to find about an hour had passed. Since he doubted he would get that last 30 minutes of sleep, he reached over for his alarm and turned it off. He was just thinking about getting out of bed when Millie's arm swung back over and hit him in the face again. Theo laid there for a few more moments before he decided to wake his siblings up. Theo chose Millie first because she was the one who woke him up. Theo sat up in bed before he leaned towards Millie, lifted her shirt, and used a tickle attack. Millie was very ticklish, so within a moment, she started to squirm and wiggle around. Not even a few seconds passed before she started to giggle before she woke up. Theo stopped his attack once she woke up and groggily looked around. Theo then pulled Isaac back onto the bed before he launched another tickle attack. Isaac didn't squirm or wiggle like Millie, though. No, Isaac instead rolled away from Theo and his fingers, right off the bed along with the blankets. There was a soft thud after he hit the floor, and a moment later he sat up and looked around in confusion. Theo chuckled to himself for a moment before he got up and said, "Both of you make my bed while I get changed." Millie yawned before she asked, "Why do we have to make your bed?" "Because you both ruined it." Millie, in her still sleepy state, glanced over the bed to find all the blankets and Isaac missing before she noticed the top of his head by the side of the bed. She crawled over to find him and all the blankets on the floor. By the time Theo stepped out of his closet, Millie and Isaac were up in his bed, while the blankets were at least back on it. Theo shook his head since he knew he would need to fix it again later. He headed upstairs with his siblings in tow before he started delegating them each tasks they needed to do. Theo himself oversaw them and also started work on the pancake batter. After Theo finished the batter, he left it off to the side to sit while he started brewing a fresh pot of coffee for his parents. Once that was going, he took the baking sheet lined up with bacon Millie created and placed it in the oven to cook. Then checked in with Isaac, who just finished cracking eggs into a bowl. Theo took that bowl and placed it next to the stove top before he grabbed a skillet and started to heat it up with some butter in it. Once the butter was melted, Theo gave the eggs a quick beating before he poured them in the skillet. As they cooked, he moved them around constantly as he made them into scrambled eggs. Just before they finished cooking, he added seasoning before he pulled them off the heat. Millie took that skillet and handed him a new one as Isaac placed the bowl of pancake batter next to Theo, along with a large ice cream scoop and spatula. Millie and Isaac worked on setting the kitchen table as Theo started to make pancakes. As he finished the first batch, the smell of bacon started to waft throughout the kitchen and into the rest of the house, along with the coffee that was brewing. After the second batch of pancakes, Theo checked on the bacon to find it almost finished, so he waited before he started more pancakes. After a few minutes, he pulled out the bacon and turned down the oven before he placed the completed pancakes inside it to stay warm. As Theo started on another batch of pancakes, Millie placed the bacon onto a paper-lined plate as Isaac started to wash the dirty dishes. The three of them worked seamlessly together for the next 10 minutes before a camera flash filled the room. Everyone turned to find Jacob with his phone in his hands as he smiled at them and said, "Smile." Jacob ended up taking a bunch more photos as Daniel walked into the kitchen and said, "Thanks for making breakfast this morning, kids." "Yeah, thanks a lot. This was a nice surprise," Jacob said as he put his phone down and started to make a cup of coffee. "You're welcome," Theo said as he started on another batch of pancakes. Millie smiled at her mom and gave her a hug as she said, "You're welcome, Mom." Isaac followed suit and did the same thing before Theo had them take the pancakes out of the oven and put them on the kitchen table. After Theo finished the last batch of pancakes, he sat down at the table to eat with his family. Their meal was mostly quiet as they ate, while both Daniel and Jacob praised the kids for their cooking. Afterwards, as they cleaned up the rest of the dishes, Millie asked, "Dad, can you teach me and Isaac how to bake again tonight?" Jacob sipped his coffee before he said, "I don't see why not. How about I show you how to make cheesecake?" "Okay," Millie and Isaac said together excitedly as Theo felt something was slightly off. After a few more minutes, Jacob and Daniel left the kitchen to go get ready since they were still in their pajamas. After they left, Millie high-fived Isaac before she said, I told you it would work. Theo turned to glare at them as he asked, You told Isaac what would work exactly? Nothing. Millie quickly shook her head as Isaac nodded in agreement. Did you do all of this just for Dad to bake sweets? Theo asked with narrowed eyes. Millie shared a glance with Isaac before she said, No. Isaac nodded in agreement before he said, I think Dad just called me. I should go. Me too. Millie said before they both bolted out of the kitchen. Theo stood there stunned for a few moments as he realized his siblings used him to get some sweets. Theo could only shake his head at the antics of his siblings as he turned around to finish the dishes. 00186. A job offer? Ezekiel portaled into a science lab he purchased a while ago. When he originally purchased it from Osborne, he gave the people working there a month-long vacation while he settled everything. When they came back and started working again, Ezekiel had a decent idea on what they were all doing, so he basically left them alone to do their own thing. While he planned to help out Connors with a body and to help out Otto with the AI for his arms, he was going to wait for a bit until they were farther along in their projects. And he kind of forgot about the both of them since he had so much other stuff he was focused on. He had a few safeguards in place that would warn him if they started getting close to starting certain experiments. But otherwise he left them alone until he got a call from Kurt Connors who asked to see him. Ezekiel stepped out into a clean and tidy workspace and glanced around for a moment before he saw a man focused on the display from his electron microscope. Ezekiel walked over to the man and looked over his shoulder at the screen for a few moments before he said, Kinda looks like an impressionist painting. The man in the chair jumped out of his seat as he turned around and asked, Who are you and how did you get in here? Ezekiel stepped back and smiled as he said, I'm Ezekiel. You just called me because you wanted to show me something. Ezekiel gestured to the screen as he asked, Is this it? I just called you 5 minutes ago. How did you get here so fast? Actually, how did you get in this room? Only I should have access to this part of the lab. The man said as he studied Ezekiel. Ezekiel smirked as he said, It's one of the perks of owning the building. Nothing is locked to me. But I didn't hear the door open. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, Maybe you missed it. You were pretty focused on that display. The man thought about it for a moment before he rubbed the back of his head and said, You're probably right. I get distracted when I focus on my research. He quickly stuck out his hand a second later as he said, Sorry, I should introduce myself properly. I'm Curtis Connors. People normally call me Kurt or Dr. Connors. Ezekiel shook his hand as he said, It's nice to meet you, Dr. Connors. After they shook hands, Ezekiel asked, So why did you call me? I had a breakthrough and wanted to ask for some more funding. Connors said as he signaled for Ezekiel to follow him. Connors led Ezekiel over to the other side of the lab where he kept a bunch of mice. He pulled out one of the cages to show a perfectly healthy white lab mouse as he said, Take a look. Ezekiel glanced at the mouse for a few moments before he asked, And what am I looking at exactly? This mouse was originally missing its front right leg. Connors said as he pulled out a folder and handed it over to Ezekiel. Ezekiel opened it up to see a bunch of dense medical notes along with pictures. Ezekiel skipped over the notes and looked at the pictures which showed the mouse regrow its leg within a matter of days. Ezekiel checked the date of when the experiment was started before he asked, Have you noticed any weird behaviors? Connors shook his head as he said, So far everything is positive and there are no adverse side effects. Ezekiel closed the folder and handed it back to Connors as he said, This is a good start. Dr. Connors, have you heard about Revival? Connors nodded his head as he said, They help people with life-threatening conditions and don't charge any money. Ezekiel nodded as he said, That's correct. But they are also working on a lot of other stuff, including a limb regeneration technique and cloning. Connor's eyebrows raised and his mouth opened slightly at the news before he quickly asked, How do you know that? I own Revival and was the person who requested the research be done. Ezekiel said with a hint of a smile. Connors grabbed Ezekiel by the shoulder as he asked, Could I possibly see their research on limb regeneration? I might be able to perfect my research so we can move on to human trials. Ezekiel removed Connor's hand from his shoulder as he said, It's a possibility, but I really don't want you to rush anything with this project. Before Connors could respond, Ezekiel cast a glance at Connor's missing arm as he said, I can understand why you would want to rush forward with this project. So how about I give you a reason to take it slowly instead? What do you mean? Connors asked as Ezekiel created a portal behind the man. Follow me and I'll show you. Ezekiel said as he walked past Connors and into the portal. Connors turned around and froze in place at the sight of the portal. Ezekiel smirked to himself before he said, "Come along now, Dr. Connors. I don't have all day." Connors snapped out of shock and quickly followed Ezekiel through the portal before he asked, "What was that? Some kind of wormhole? Is that an innate power or is it technology-based?" "It was created with magic," Ezekiel said as he led Connors into the medical facility. Connor laughed for a moment before he asked, "Magic? That's a pretty good joke. But seriously, how did you do that?" "I already told you, magic." Connors didn't believe it, but decided not to press the issue as he followed Ezekiel into a high-tech lab with some equipment he'd never seen, let alone heard about before. Inside the lab, a few people were working in front of some computers as a complex simulation ran on a main screen off to the side. Connors was the first one to speak as he asked a question about the data being displayed on the screen. Both people turned around as Orochimaru said, "That's correct. We are in the process of—" Ezekiel interrupted him as he said, "You guys can talk after I leave." Ezekiel pointed at Connors as he said, "This is Dr. Kurt Connors, and he is here for a new body." "What new body?" Connors asked in confusion. "I told you. I'm going to give you a reason to take your research slow and steady." Ezekiel pointed at each person in the room as he introduced them quickly before he said, "All right, I have other things I need to do. Just call me once he is ready to leave so I can send him home." "Wait, where are you going? And what did you mean by new body?" Connors asked as he looked at Ezekiel. "Just ask them about it. I have something else to do," Ezekiel said before his afterimage faded away. Connors glanced at the other people in the room as he asked, "What did he mean by new body?" Orochimaru licked his lips with his snake-like tongue before he was smacked by Tobirama, who said, "Stop doing that. It's creepy." After Ezekiel left, he created a portal back to the laboratory building, but this time went to the other lab. Inside, he found a slightly more chaotic workshop, but otherwise more clean than Tony's personal lab. The lab itself was currently empty, so Ezekiel pulled out his tablet to check the lab's security to find out where Dr. Otto Octavius was. The security logs and video showed he arrived at the lab earlier today and that he had yet to leave. With that information, Ezekiel decided to take a look around before he went to find Otto, who was probably taking a break. The lab itself wasn't so bad, but there seemed to be a lot of projects all over the place in different stages of being worked on. Ezekiel started to wonder if Otto already completed his robotic arms before he found the iconic harness only half finished in one corner of the lab. It was hooked up to a computer, so Ezekiel decided to check it out. On the computer itself was diagnostic software for the harness along with the basics for a control program. Ezekiel glanced over the diagnostic program for a few moments before he turned his attention to the software for the arms. At a glance, he could tell it was bare bones, and worse than that, it was bad. Sure, it wasn't even close to being finished, but Ezekiel couldn't stand how bad it was and wanted to delete it all and start the code over from scratch. As Ezekiel looked over the code, the lab door opened up and two people walked in. The first one was a man about average height with brown hair and eyes. He was pudgy with a bowl cut and thick black framed glass that rested on his large nose. Next to him was a woman with long brown hair tied into a braid that stopped at the middle of her back. She had bright blue eyes with a smile to match and was currently holding hands with the man. Ezekiel heard the door open up, and as the couple walked in, he turned around and asked, "Who wrote this code?" Both people froze as they looked at Ezekiel for a moment before the man said with some pride, "I did." Ezekiel raised an eyebrow as he asked, "Where exactly did you learn how to code?" "I taught myself," the man said smugly. "That explains a lot. You suck at it, and you need to hire someone else to do it." The man flushed with a bit of anger as he said, "Everyone I hired turned out to be idiots, so I decided to do it myself. I'm not sure what they created for you, but I doubt it's as bad as this crap," Ezekiel said as he pointed at the code displayed on the computer. The man moved closer to Ezekiel and the computer as he said, "Everything they created was 100 times worse than that." Ezekiel rolled his eyes as he said, "I doubt that. I know a 10-year-old who can program better than this garbage." The man got up into Ezekiel's face before he said, "I would like to see you do better." "Easy, just watch and I'll show you what proper coding looks like," Ezekiel said before he turned towards the computer and opened a new text editor before he started to type. Ezekiel's fingers flew across the keyboard at incredible speed as he typed away. Within 20 minutes, he had already recreated something similar to the code he called garbage. Except his code was neatly done without a bunch of extra lines of redundant code or garbage code, and accomplished the same results as the old code. Ezekiel finished up and double-checked his code before he turned back to the man and woman behind him. The man looked at the code in excitement for a few moments before he turned to Ezekiel and said, "You're hired." Ezekiel smirked at that as he said, "You don't even know who I am." "Oh," the man said as he seemed to realize something before he asked, "Who are you and how did you get into my lab? Also, do you want a job? It pays well." Ezekiel chuckled before he said, "I'm Ezekiel. As for how I entered your lab, I own the building and fund your research." The man thought about it for a few moments before he nodded his head and said, "Yes, yes. I remember you sent me an email after you bought this place from Norman." The man stuck out his hand as he said, "I'm Dr. Otto Octavius, and this is my wife, Rosalie." Ezekiel shook hands with Otto as he said, "Good to finally meet you both." After they shook hands, Otto asked, "So about that job offer? 00187 you work for." While Otto was a little arrogant when you challenged him or questioned his skill, he was actually very easy to talk to, and Ezekiel found he really liked the man. After chatting for a while, Ezekiel agreed to do all the programming work for the man going forward. Since programming was his main skill set, and he could easily use clones to get all of the work done. Besides, he didn't want Otto to become his supervillain counterpart, so he would keep a closer eye on him going forward. Once he finished up his business with Otto and his wife, Ezekiel headed back to the medical lab to check in with Dr. Connors. He found Connors engrossed in a conversation with Orochimaru, Tobarama, and a few other people about his research. Since that was the case, Ezekiel headed home until he needed to portal the man back to his laboratory. A little while after Ezekiel arrived back home, he received a phone call, but it wasn't for Connors. Wilson Fisk finally called and wanted to talk with Ezekiel in person again. Ezekiel agreed on a time and place before he hung up the phone and went to go train until it was time for the meeting. Hours later, Ezekiel portaled to one of the tallest buildings in Hell's Kitchen where Fisk wanted to meet him. He stepped out onto the roof of the building to find Fisk. Fisk stood alone near the edge of the roof with his hands behind his back as he looked out over the city. As Ezekiel approached Fisk, he asked, "So what did you want to talk about?" Fisk didn't turn around as he said, "You said you could see the future, so you must know what I plan to do for this city. I know your overall goal was to help the city, but the actions you plan to take would hurt a lot of innocent people along the way. But it would help more people than it would harm," Fisk said as he glanced towards Ezekiel for a moment. "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." Fisk nodded in response as he said, "Exactly." Ezekiel shook his head slightly before he said, "That's only acceptable when you have no other choice. But you currently have other options, Mr. Fisk." Fisk stared out over the city for about a minute before he asked, "I looked into you after our first meeting. Do you know what I found?" Ezekiel looked out over the edge of the building at the neighborhood below as he said, "No idea." Fisk glanced down towards Ezekiel as he said, "Practically nothing. You appeared out of nowhere a few years ago. No formal ID, no birth records, no records at all from what I've gathered, and only a handful of photos and video clips scattered around online." Fisk turned to face Ezekiel before he said, "And yet, as far as I can tell, you are the sole owner of Vibe Media Corporation, one of the most talked about companies in the world since the launch of Stark's phone." Ezekiel shrugged as he asked, "And your point is? You're a ghost that popped up out of nowhere, and now you want me to work with you?" Ezekiel turned to face Fisk as he chuckled before he said, "You're wrong. You won't be working with me. You'll be working for me." Before Fisk could respond, Ezekiel held up a hand and said, "You would be like an independent contractor, and I would only give you a general goal of what I would like for you to accomplish. If you're able to do it, you'll be rewarded and get more work." Ezekiel turned back to looking out over the city as he said, "All of the goals I give you should be easy to do. They will just take effort on your part to accomplish. That being said, I expect whatever it is to be done correctly. I don't need or want anything done quickly. I just need it done right the first time." After Ezekiel stopped talking for a few moments, Fisk asked, "And what exactly do you plan to have me do? Are you accepting my offer? You can consider me interested, but I want to know more before I commit to anything," Fisk said. Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, "I want you to do exactly what you already planned to do, but you need to change one thing about it. I want you to focus on better housing for lower-income families instead of the rich." Fisk frowned as he said, "There's barely any money to be made in that sector, and it would hold back my other plans." "You're right. But you wouldn't be doing this to make money. The goal is to help people in need. Besides, I already told you, if you do everything right, you'll never have to worry about money." Ezekiel turned back to Fisk as he said, "Besides, you are missing out on what will happen if you do it correctly." "And what exactly is that?" "If you build something that is nice and also affordable for people with low income, you won't have any issue with keeping tenants. You do that enough, and the slum lords in the area around your buildings might not be able to find renters anymore." Fisk nodded along before he said, "And that's when I offer to buy up their building." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Exactly. Then you tear it down and build another low-income focused property. It might work for some, but there are people out there who own their buildings and wouldn't want to sell it, even if I offered to pay double what it is worth. And that's one of the reasons why I said you would be working for me, not with me. If you have any type of problem that you can't solve through normal, legal means, you contact me and I'll deal with it." Ezekiel said with a smile before he added, "I want you to keep your image clean along with how you do business. What's the other reason I would be working for you and not with you? Because honestly, you don't matter in the grand scheme of things that I am working towards. I could easily replace you with anyone and get the same results. It's all just a matter of time for me, really." Ezekiel said with a shrug, "If I'm that disposable, then why did you come to me in the first place?" Fisk asked with a hint of frustration in his voice. "Because you would get in the way of my plans eventually, and things wouldn't have gone well for you when that happened. You are a very smart, capable, and driven man, Mr. Fisk. A man I could use to do great things with, and I want to give you a path forward. One where you are not limited in the future by being a criminal." Ezekiel studied Fisk for a moment before he said, "If you work for me, I expect you to behave and keep your nose clean. I'll give you some chances, but not many. And if you do something really bad, don't expect to wind up in jail." Fisk thought about it for a few more moments before he stuck out his hand and said, "I look forward to our first project together." Ezekiel shook his hand as he said, "As do I. VVVVV." A couple weeks passed by and Kurt Connors was given a new body while Theo finished up all the current programming jobs Otto needed done. He also gave Fisk his first project and put him in touch with Adrian Toombs so his company could do the demolition of the building. He also put another project into motion which involved the remnants of the hand. While they were now focused on helping people and communities, Theo used the New York members as a test bed for the trade skill program he wanted to do. Since he already had Adrian and Fisk, he would use them to help move the project forward. They would each get a handful of young people who would be taught to be craftsmen in different fields. It was almost like becoming an apprentice in a union, except Theo founded the whole thing himself and no one had to pay for it. If it worked well, he planned to expand it to other cities where ex-hand members operated. Besides that, Theo just got out of school for winter break and was heading to his dad's shop with Peter, Millie, Isaac, and Teresa. They almost always go there after school, unless their parents pick them up. As they walked, Millie was looking through a book on cakes she picked up from the library, while Isaac and Teresa chatted about when they should do their holiday homework. Peter glanced over his shoulder at his little sister as he said, "Let's just do it once we get to the shop. That way we can have fun for the holidays and not have to worry about it." Theo nodded in agreement as he said, "We can even help you with it if you get stuck." Millie glanced up from her book and said, "But I want to finish reading this book." "You just want to look at pictures of cakes," Theo said with a knowing smile. Millie shook her head in denial before she said, "I am reading the recipes." Theo quickly snatched the book from Millie's hands as she said, "Hey, give that back. I just want to see if you learned anything." Theo said as he glanced at the recipe on the page Millie was just looking at and asked, "What are some of the ingredients for this double chocolate cake you were looking at?" Millie glanced at Theo for a few moments before she confidently said, "I don't know." "I knew it. You were only looking at the pictures of cake because that's all you can think about. Your brain must be full of cake." "It is not," Millie said as her cheeks puffed out and she placed her hands on her hips. "It has to be. That's the only logical explanation for why you like cake so much." "I just like cake. My brain isn't full of cake," Millie said as she tried to grab her book back from Theo. Theo dodged her and started to run away from her. So Millie started to chase him as she said, "Theo, get back here." Theo just started to laugh as he kept just out of reach of Millie as they ran down the sidewalk before Millie said, "If you're brave, stop running. If you stop chasing, I'll stop running." Theo said with a smile on his face, "If you didn't start running, I wouldn't have started chasing you." Millie said with her cheeks puffed out, "If you don't chase, why would I run?" Theo asked before he stuck out his tongue and kept running. The chase lasted until they reached the shop, where Theo finally placed the book down on a table but didn't stop running until Millie stopped chasing him. The others caught up about 5 minutes later before they all headed down to the basement where they could do homework, since the basement was turned into a private laboratory for Richard and Mary. They had a couple quiet offices that they kids could use to do homework in if they wanted. It was better than trying to do it in the upstairs office, since the sounds from the shop were pretty loud sometimes. 00188. Money glitch? For Christmas Eve this year, Theo did his same tradition of giving everyone a couple of gifts. He dropped them off at the base first before he portaled over to Xavier's school and dropped presents off for everyone there. Afterwards, he portaled to Kamartaj, where he set up a tree with lights and dropped off gifts for all of the sorcerers there. While Theo himself didn't train with everyone else, he visited the library there a bunch and met most of the people training there. So most of them knew him as Ezekiel, the Ancient One's apprentice. Once he finished off with being Santa, Ezekiel stopped by the medical facility and picked up Tsunade before he portaled to Tony's workshop. As they stepped out of the portal, Jarvis said, "Welcome, Ezekiel and Mississippi Senju. Mr. Stark is currently in the living room with Mississippi Potts." "Thanks, Jarvis. You know my services don't come cheap. I better be getting paid for this." Ezekiel frowned as he glanced at Tsunade and asked, "Didn't I just give you like 10 million a few days ago?" Tsunade shrugged as she followed Ezekiel to the stairs as she said, "It's gone." "How do you keep losing so much money?" Ezekiel asked as he opened the door leading upstairs. "It was just some bad luck is all." "You say that every time. But there is no way your luck is really that bad. It's statistically impossible," Ezekiel said as he shook his head. When Ezekiel and Tsunade arrived in the living room, they found Tony cuddled up on one of the couches with Pepper as they talked about something quietly. Ezekiel smiled to himself for a moment before he made his presence known. Tony turned from his spot on the couch to see Ezekiel before he let out a sigh and said, "Jarvis, we've talked about notifying me whenever Ezekiel visited." "I did, sir." "No, you didn't," Tony said in an annoyed tone. "If you check your email, you will find that I notified you over a minute ago." "That's not how you should notify me about Ezekiel," Tony said as he got up from the couch. Pepper stood up from the couch as well and went to greet Ezekiel and Tsunade as Jarvis said, "You never stated exactly how I should inform you, so I chose email as the default." Tony glanced at Ezekiel as he said, "I never should have had you help me with programming, Jarvis." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I just helped with the initial programming. This behavior is all Jarvis. I like it though." "Thank you, sir." "Don't encourage him," Tony said as he playfully punched Ezekiel on the shoulder. Ezekiel chuckled as he turned to Pepper and asked, "How are you doing?" "I'm good, and so is the baby," Pepper said as she rubbed her belly that was still mostly flat. Ezekiel nodded before he said, "I know Tony found a doctor who is under NDA to watch over you and the baby. But I brought Tsunade by to give you a checkup just to be safe." Tony glanced at Tsunade, who was having Pepper laid down on the couch as he said, "You sure this is necessary?" "The doctor I hired said everything is fine. Better safe than sorry. Besides, Tsunade has better ways to check the condition of Pepper and the baby," Ezekiel said as he motioned towards Tsunade as she checked over Pepper with green light coming out of her plants. As they both watched Tsunade work, Ezekiel asked, "Looks like everything is going good, huh?" "There are some issues, but overall it's going well." Ezekiel patted Tony on the shoulder as he said, "Good. I'm happy for you guys. Just don't fuck it up." Tony shoved Ezekiel as he said, "Shut up. Don't try and jinx us." "So how long are you planning to keep this all a secret?" Tony shrugged slightly as he watched Tsunade work before he said, "We're not completely sure yet, but it definitely won't be until after the baby is born." "What about marriage?" Ezekiel asked. "We're not worried about it just yet. Besides, we need to see if this can work out long-term in the first place." Ezekiel rubbed a fake tear from his eye as he asked, "Did you just sound like a responsible adult? Is my little Tony growing up right before my eyes?" "I believe he is, sir," Jarvis said. "I hate both of you." "Understood, sir." Jarvis said with what sounded like a hint of mirth. Tsunade finished her exam a few minutes later and said, "Both you and the baby are in great shape. I'll come do another checkup in a month, but if anything happens between now and then, just contact Ezekiel and we'll be here in minutes." "Thank you. I appreciate it," Pepper said before Tsunade replied, "Don't mention it. Besides, Ezekiel is paying me to be on call." Tsunade turned towards Ezekiel and held out her hand as she said, "Speaking of which, I need to be paid." "I'll take care of it. How much is it?" Tony asked. 10 million. Tsunade said as she held out her hand towards Tony. 10 million. Pepper and Tony said at the same time with a hint of shock. Tony recovered quickly as he asked, "Is that for the entire pregnancy?" Ezekiel opened a portal to some drug cartel stash and started pulling out money as he said, "It shouldn't even be that much for the whole thing. But Tsunade will lose 10 million in a week and complain like a little kid if I don't give her more money." "I don't complain like a little kid." Ezekiel rolled his eyes as he tossed about $10 million on the floor before he closed the portal and said, "She even refuses to work if I don't pay her soon enough." Tsunade started sealing the money away with a smile as Tony asked, "How much money have you given her?" "More than the average GDP of most small countries," Ezekiel said with a forced smile. Tsunade finished storing her money before she stood up and said, "All right, make me a portal to Vegas. I'm feeling lucky." As Ezekiel created a portal, Tony said, "If you go to my casino, I'll text the floor manager and tell them to take care of you." Before Tsunade stepped through the portal, she asked, "Who? Robbie, Frank, or Susan?" Ezekiel patted Tony on the shoulder moments later as he said, "Tsunade is the best whale your casino has. She is probably the best whale in the whole world because she almost never wins." Tsunade frowned as she said, "I've just been on a losing streak. It won't last long." Ezekiel waved Tsunade towards the portal as he said, Sure. Go enjoy yourself." After the portal closed, Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "It won't last long? Her losing streak has pretty much lasted her whole life. It can't be that bad. No one is that unlucky." Pepper said, "Jarvis, how much has Tony's casino made from Tsunade this year?" Ezekiel asked. "Mississippi Senju has spent just over 400 million this year according to casino records." Pepper went a little pale as Tony laughed and put his arm over Ezekiel's shoulder and said, "Thanks a lot, buddy." Ezekiel shoved Tony away as he said, "You're not welcome. And don't expect it to happen much longer." "What? Why not?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I've been building a casino on Genosha. Once it's completed, that will be the only place I let Tsunade gamble going forward." "No fair. You shouldn't hog a cash cow like that. You didn't even realize she was a cash cow until I just told you," Ezekiel said as he shook his head. "To be fair, I don't pay attention to any of the businesses I own, unless they start to lose money and someone brings it up," Tony said with a shrug. "Isn't Tsunade just spending Ezekiel's money?" Pepper asked. Tony shook his head as he said, "No. Ezekiel steals money from criminals and gives it to Tsunade to use. He basically uses her to launder stolen money. Currently, all that money is going to you." "I know, which is why you should let her visit my casino more often," Tony said with a smile. "Why are you stealing money? Don't you make enough from Vibe and the deals you have in place with Tony?" Pepper asked as she stared at Ezekiel in surprise. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Sure, I have money. But criminals also have money that they will use to help commit more crimes with. So if I steal money from criminals, I see it as helping to prevent crime." Ezekiel flashed a smile and threw up the peace sign as he said, "You can think of me as a superhero. I'll consider you a superhero if you keep sending Tsunade to my casino. Or make me a partner for the casino you are making in Genosha." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No way. The Genosha casino is already owned by me and Magneto with plans for it to basically fund the island going forward." "Is the casino really going to make enough money to run Genosha?" Pepper asked. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "That's why Tsunade is only allowed to gamble at my casino. She should easily be able to fund Genosha each year." Ezekiel ended up staying with Tony and Pepper for a little while before he headed home for the night. Tomorrow was Christmas, and he knew it would be a busy day. His whole extended family got together and hung out all day at May and Ben's house. After dinner was finished, Theo made a couple plates of food and sealed them away to keep them fresh. It wasn't hard. He just made a simple genjutsu to make everyone not notice what he was doing. He also packed up a couple of each dessert along with some eggnog and a few other snacks. Once everything was prepared and sealed away, he moved back to where he should be and canceled the Jinjutsu. While Theo didn't like to use his skills on his family, sometimes it was needed because he had no other choice. Once Theo and his family returned home, he created a clone and headed down to his training room. From there, he switched into Ezekiel before he headed towards Genosha and the magic school after that. After he arrived in the hidden basement area, he found Tao waiting for him as she played on her phone. Ezekiel pulled out some of the holiday cookies Millie and Isaac made, along with a present which he placed down on her coffee table. Tao placed her phone down and pulled out a gift herself as she said, "Merry Christmas." Ezekiel took the gift and sealed it away as he said, "Merry Christmas to you too." Tao nodded before she created a portal to hell as she said, "Enjoy your date." Ezekiel knew better than to respond, so he just stepped through the portal instead. As he arrived, he found Hella with a slight smile on her face as she said, "Welcome back. 00189, finding some potential threats." It was a couple weeks after Christmas, and Theo's patience finally paid off. One of the people he was looking for appeared and was now on his radar. He didn't plan to meet them yet, because he wanted to see the type of person they were in this reality. But he was pretty sure he knew what they would be like, and one word could describe it: egotistical. For what else could Victor Von Doom be? Theo had searched for the man for a while since he was concerned with how powerful a threat he could become. But when he found out Reed Richards was only in his teens, he realized Victor would be close to the same age. Which was actually strange since Reed and Doom should be older than Tony, or at least closer to his age. Then again, a lot of people in this universe had weird ages. Take Banner for example. The guy was younger than Tony, when he should be older than Tony by at least 10 years. Even though Banner is currently mid-20s, he easily looks older than Tony. Theo would probably have to help the guy out before he hits his 30s and looks like an old man with gray hair. The only positive from the age change with Reed was that Johnny Storm was the same age as Theo and Peter. Peter and Johnny always had a good friendship in the comics, which would be even better now since Peter enjoyed cars. Theo was pretty sure he would get along with Johnny too, maybe. Worst case, Theo would humble Johnny and his ego a bit, but could bond over cars afterwards. As for Doom, it turned out he was in his home country, and that was why Theo couldn't find him. Since his home country was basically a shithole ruled by a ruthless dictator and his family. The place barely had electricity over half the country, let alone internet or computers. Sure, the ruling family had all of that, but Theo couldn't use that to help him find Doom. Theo didn't currently know much about this Doom, but that would all change now that the man was in New York. He somehow gained a full scholarship to State University in Heegman, New York. It was also the same place Reed Richards and Ben Grimm currently attended. Theo already set up monitoring devices in both Reed and Doom's labs, as well as a few other places. Not only was the tech he used shrunken down with PIM particles, he also used Fuinjutsu and magic to conceal everything. While he didn't think he needed to bug Reed's lab, with the man's track history in the comics of being a good guy, that same track record also proved the man was an idiot when it came to things like basic common sense. So Theo decided to be proactive, just in case something happened. Theo also placed some ninjas at the school to monitor Doom and Reed as well. He had 24 people split into teams of 3, working 4 different shifts to monitor both men. So far there was no issue with anything, and Theo doubted there would be. Not only were they ninjas skilled in stealth and concealment, but they were also all Uchihas who specialized in Jinjutsu. With all of that in place, Theo left instruction in case certain things or events happened. Like the incident that caused Doom to be thrown out of school and his face being marred, which would cause him to beef with Reed for the rest of time. While Theo didn't care much if Doom had an issue with Reed in the overall scheme of things, he did care about all of the issues that would happen because of it. And since most of the time it happened in New York, well, that wouldn't be good for Theo or his family. As for Doom and taking over his home country, Theo didn't see that necessarily as a bad thing. Sure, he could be an oppressive ruler, but he tended to be a good ruler overall. If Theo could change Doom a little bit and make him less arrogant, he was sure the man would be a good ally or even friend to have. But first, Theo would need to watch the man and confirm he was worth investing in. Otherwise, Theo would eliminate Doom and the potential threat he could turn into. While that was going on, Theo used all the star maps and information he gathered from alien ships to create a map of the universe. It was far from complete, and there were chunks missing, but overall it was about 70% completed. The important part was it currently had the places he cared about on it. The first and most important was Morag, since Theo planned to collect the Power Stone now and replace it with a fake. Next on his list was Xander, since he wanted to hack into their systems and monitor it for information. Well, and he promised to take Tony there so he could see a different planet with alien life. He also planned to bring Pepper, Happy, and Anna along so Tony wouldn't do something stupid. Who was he kidding? Tony would still do something stupid. Theo also found the location for Nowhere. He didn't really need to visit the place, but Theo had some thoughts about taking out the collector. The man was not a great person, and honestly Theo kind of wanted to see what stuff the guy had. The last place Theo was looking for was Vormer, which he easily found. It was marked on a couple of star charts in a dead solar system. While Theo thought it would be hidden because Gamora said she burned the map to the Soul Stone in one of the movies. It turns out the planet and solar system was known, it's just no one went there. It was far off the normal travel paths for interstellar travel and very inconvenient to get to in the first place. Which made sense since apparently the soul of the Red Skull was just hanging out there this whole time and no one knew about it. Since Theo already planned to collect the Soul Stone, he was in the process of figuring out a way to do it without sacrificing someone he cared about. As for other things Theo was working on or waiting for them to happen, Theo was paying close attention to Banner. The man didn't seem to take Theo's advice to heart as he was in the process of rushing his research because Ross was threatening to pull the contract if results weren't shown soon. It was currently leading to Banner becoming the Hulk, and Theo had no plan to stop it. He would definitely warn Banner before he attempted the experiment, but he would never stop him. Theo also checked in on the Hand and the people he currently had in charge. All of the projects he set in place were going smoothly and was met with positive feedback back from each of the communities they were started in. The members of the Hand also helped clean up crime in the communities they worked in and made those places a lot safer. Theo had them work in the shadows, mostly doing that because they would sometimes kill people who weren't worth saving and also collected any money or assets they could at the same time. It was the darker side to what the new Hand was, but it was necessary and gave some of the members used to doing that type of work a purpose. They were all the members that hadn't lost their humanity doing that type of work and now put those skills to work for good instead of evil. Theo also had those people talk with Yamanaka clan members each week to keep their mental health in check. As for Wilson Fisk, he was already well into the process of his first project for Theo. It was a brownstone complex that Theo wanted renovated and updated. While Theo would rather tear the whole place down and start from scratch, it was considered historic, so that approach wasn't possible. Fisk didn't mind though, and was in the process of gutting the whole place to reinforce it and update it. It would be almost the same cost as demolishing and building something new, but even Theo couldn't change the laws. Yet, speaking of laws, or more specifically the government in general, Theo's plan to get smartphones in the hands of politicians was going smoothly. He already collected a good amount of information on certain people and planned to clean house once he collected enough information. He was already sending out ninjas to bug those people's homes and offices along with anyone they dealt with regularly. Theo was pretty sure he would have to focus on one person at a time, otherwise the US government would lose over half its politicians at the same time, which wouldn't be good. Or maybe it would be. It would be something Theo would have to think about as he collected more incriminating information. As for bringing those politicians to justice once their crimes were exposed, well, if they tried to pull anything with the connection they had, Theo planned to stop it. If they still somehow escaped normal justice, well, Theo would just take care of it himself. The same thing went for the companies and CEOs Theo was monitoring. Theo planned to remove everyone who was corrupt from every position of power he could until they were replaced by people who were honest and just wanted to do the right thing and help people. It would be harder for companies, but as long as they weren't trying to rip off customers, he would call it a win. Theo also checked in on Norman to make sure everything was going fine for the man. While Theo didn't plan to intervene in the man's life again, he still wanted to make sure nothing bad happened to him or his family. So far everything was going well, and apparently Norman and his wife have been busy because she was very pregnant. It looked like Norman took Theo's advice and decided to have a bigger family. As for the projects Theo gave Norman as a gift, so far they were going well, and Theo was sure he would see one of them completed within a few years. They weren't too crazy, but useful, and with them, while Norman and his family would never have to worry about money for generations to come if he patented them. The last thing that happened since Christmas was a person Theo was interested in recruiting popped up on his radar. Theo planned to do it later in the next 5 years or so, but Emil Blonsky showed up in one of the reports his clones were going over, and Theo decided to meet the man earlier than planned. Theo double-checked he had everything he might need before he changed into Ezekiel and created a portal to the Middle East where the man was currently stationed. He stepped out of the portal into the middle of the desert, where he pulled out his tablet and checked it over for a few moments before he disappeared in an after-image as he headed towards the man's last known location. 00190, meeting in a war zone. The noise was deafening as small arms fire filled the air of a run-down village. On one side was a small team of British Royal Marines, and on the other was an unorganized group of men who were trying their best to kill them. While the smaller group was outnumbered and outgunned, they were doing a good job of staying alive so far. A bullet slammed into the wall Emil was using for cover as he pulled out a fresh magazine and loaded it into his rifle. He then glanced down at the last full magazine he had left, still in his vest, before he looked to his right. On the ground about 20 feet from him was one of his men, dead. An unlucky, or maybe a lucky shot, took the man in the head right as this whole thing started not 15 minutes ago. It was actually a miracle no one else was injured as they all scrambled for cover after that first shot fired and all hell broke loose. Sure, they at least had decent cover for now, but they were also pinned down and things weren't looking great for them. While Emil would be lying if he said he wasn't upset about one of his men being killed. But right now his only concern was the ammo that rested on that man's body. Everything else didn't matter and wouldn't matter until the rest of his men were back at base. Emil glanced towards the other members of his squad before he queued up his microphone and asked, "Ammo count?" All of them answered back without even looking at their carrier vests, and the answers made Emil frown. They had maybe 10 minutes at most before they ran out of ammunition. If that happened before support arrived, well, it wouldn't go well for Emil and the rest of his squad. Emil glanced at the body of his man again, over 20 feet away with absolutely no cover around it. The same one that was out in the open and would be a death sentence to try and get to. Emil clicked the button for the other channel on his headset before he queued it up and asked, "Chaos Main, Chaos Main. This is Wolf 6, do you copy? Over. Wolf 6, this is Chaos Main. Over. Chaos Main ETA on backup? Over. Wolf 6, Hawk Tree is inbound. ETA 20 minutes. Over." Emil's brow furrowed at the reply as he said, "Chaos Main, Roger. Wolf 6 out." Emil glanced at the body 20 feet away from him one more time before he made up his mind. He queued up his squad radio as he asked, "How many smoke grenades do we have?" After he heard the answer, Emil said, "I want them tossed in front of us and towards the building to our left." Emil watched as his men followed his command as he quickly striped off his pack and tack vest. He then changed position so he could run as he crept closer to the edge of his cover. Emil waited for the smoke to fill the area before he said, "Give me a tiny bit of suppressive fire on my command and make it look like we are moving." "Now," Emil said over the radio before he sprinted 20 feet to grab his squad member by his tactical vest and pulled the man's body back into his piece of cover. The tactic worked, and Emil was able to drag the man's body back to cover as the enemy focused their fire towards the building to the left of them. Emil removed the man's pack before he flipped the body over. There was a blood hole just below where the man's helmet ended, only millimeters away from what could have saved his life. Emil stared down at the dead eyes of his man, still opened, staring at nothing. Emil quickly did the sign of the cross before he closed the man's eyes and then stripped the man of all his ammo. Emil then passed them down to his men as he said over the squad radio, "Make these count. This is all we have until support arrives." With a couple more magazines of ammo for each man, 3 frag grenades, and 2 smoke grenades. Emil felt better about lasting until help arrived, but it was only a little bit. They were still pinned down and being overwhelmed by a disorganized group of attackers. If the enemy was actually trained and not thrown together, Emil was positive that his squad would already be dead or worse. Emil tossed his tack vest back over his plate carrier before he pulled a small mirror on a collapsible shaft from his tack vest and extended it. He held it out around his cover for a couple moments before a round of bullets slammed into the wall in front of Emil. In that brief moment, he was able to make out the muzzle flash from a couple of windows across the way. He queued up his microphone as he said, If you can get a shot, the windows directly north of my position have shooters. A 3-round burst from one of his men went off before he heard over the radio, "One tango down," quickly followed by another 3-round burst, and "Make that a pair." Emil smiled to himself for a moment before he used his mirror again to find another target. As he glanced through the mirror, more bullets slammed into his position before a chunk of wall fell next to him. He was distracted by it for a moment, which tilted his mirror to the side, and his eyes went wide as he yelled out, "Get down!" A second after Emil dropped prone, an explosion destroyed most of the wall next to him and dazed him. Dust and debris filled the air as Emil queued up his microphone and asked, "Status check." As Emil slowly sat back up, he thankfully heard all of his men confirm they were still alive. A few were hit with shrapnel from the blast, but no one reported a major injury. Even with the after effects of the blast, Emil wasted no time as he commanded his men back into action. And the 2 smoke grenades were quickly used to buy them a bit of reprieve as they attempted to recover. It didn't last long as another RPG flew through the smoke and barely missed his position, only feet away as it sailed past his head. It luckily missed everything and flew out of the village before it exploded. Emil frowned as he glanced where the last one went before he turned to see the smoke start to clear. He then looked at what was left of their cover and knew that another RPG would probably kill him or someone else in the squad. Before the smoke could fully clear, he cued his microphone and said, "Those rockets are coming from the building to the northeast. Someone see if you can get a shot on them." "Acknowledged," came the reply from a couple of people. Emil used his mirror to watch that area as the smoke fully cleared and even more bullets rained down on their position. Just before the smoke cleared completely, a person with a freshly loaded RPG stepped out of cover. As Emil started to call out the target, a 3-round burst took the man in the chest. The man still managed to squeeze the trigger as he collapsed, but he was twisted towards where he stepped out from. The RPG launched and slammed directly into the building next to the man a moment later, which must have set off the rest of his ammo as that whole building exploded. Even behind cover, Emil was tossed back onto the ground from the massive explosion. A silence hung over the previous chaotic area for almost a minute as everyone recovered from the blast wave. The dust cloud hung heavy in the air with the smell of roasted meat and sulfur as Emil sat back up. Emil only took a few moments before he queued his microphone up and asked, "Status?" When everyone confirmed they were okay, Emil said, "We're moving to the building to the left before this cover is gone." "Acknowledged." His team responded as Emil got up into a better position for moving. As Emil moved closer to his squad, he said into his microphone, "Moving now." Emil quickly moved through the thick cloud of dust with his team, and once they reached the new building, started to clear it. It was a small, run-down building with thick walls and 2 exits. Emil posted 1 man to cover the rear door as he had the rest of his men set up at different positions. At this point, the smoke was starting to clear, and the members of the attacking force finally recovered. And they started to rain down fire on Emil's previous position as Emil had his men hold return fire. After about a minute or so, the enemy fire died down, and a couple of brave men cautiously crept out of their cover. They slowly moved towards where Emil and his team used to be. Emil had his men hold their fire for as long as possible before he took a shot at one of the men out in the open. His men followed suit, and a moment later the enemies still in cover returned fire. Just as the fighting returned to its fever pitch again, someone near Emil said, "You look like you could use a hand." Emil and his men instantly turned towards the voice with their weapons and found a man leaning against the wall of the building. He was dressed in a nice business suit, and he had a tablet in his hand that he was looking at. Emil was positive the man wasn't there a few moments ago and almost thought he was hallucinating if his men didn't react the same way. It was a testament to their skill that none of them shot the man in their current situation. Emil didn't have time to deal with whatever was going on and was about to order one of his men to restrain the man. Just before Emil spoke, a couple of stray bullets slammed into something that simmered with golden light about a foot away from the man and turned into pancakes before they dropped to the ground. The shimmering faded just as quickly as it appeared, and the man glanced up from his tablet before he asked, "Do you want some help? Or do you guys not understand America?" Emil frowned at whatever just happened, along with the man's casual demeanor and stupid joke before he turned back towards the enemy as he asked, "Who the hell are you? Some kind of CIA spook?" I'm not with any of those three-digit agencies. But you can call me Ezekiel. Emil glanced towards the man from the corner of his eye as he asked, "How did you get in here? Were you hiding in here before we arrived?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "I just got here. I heard that massive explosion and rushed over." Emil fired off a 3-round burst into a window as he asked, "How exactly are you going to help us? Do you have a way out of here or some backup close by?" Ezekiel placed his tablet down and pulled out a kunai which he spun around his pinky a couple of times as he said, "Tell your men to hold their fire." Before Emil could reply, Ezekiel's after-image faded from view. Emil glanced towards his squad members for a moment before they all lowered their weapons slightly. Within moments, the sound of gunfire became less and less before it died out completely. After a few more moments, Ezekiel walked out of one of the other buildings with a man over his shoulder. He waved towards Emil's location as he said, "It's all clear. You guys can come out now. I also captured the enemy leader for you." Emil glanced towards his men before he said, "Stay here. I'll go check it out myself." Emil cautiously moved out of the building and met Ezekiel out in the open as he asked, "You took care of everyone?" Ezekiel dropped the man he was carrying onto the ground as he said, "There were only about 20 normal people left. That explosion looks like it took out at least 10 people. Then again, it's kinda hard to count chunks of bodies." Emil moved past Ezekiel and into the building he just left to find 3 men on the ground with their throats slit. He glanced into another building and found more men dead the same way. As he walked out of that building, he queued his microphone up and said, "It's all clear. You guys can come out now." Once Emil was back in front of Ezekiel, he asked, "So, Ezekiel, why are you out here running around in this hellhole?" Ezekiel pulled out a business card and handed it to Emil as he said, "I was actually looking for you. I came to offer you a job." Emil glanced at the card which only had a phone number on it as he said, "I appreciate the help, but as you can see, I already have a job. One I enjoy doing." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "And you're good at it too, which is why I came to offer you a job doing basically the same thing you do now. Expect better pay, the best medical care in the world, and more interesting missions than what you currently do." Emil flipped the card over to check the back as he said, "I'll think about it. I look forward to hearing from you." Ezekiel said as he flashed a smile before he opened up a portal and disappeared through it. Emil glanced at where Ezekiel disappeared from before he turned towards his men as he pocketed the card and said, "Secure the area while we wait for our ride."